Daniel Harris had been walking through the Arctic night for nearly 2 hours, and his legs burned with exhaustion as he carried the last of the equipment back to the research station because the storm had damaged their external sensors, and someone had to retrieve them before they were buried under 10 feet of snow. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees, and even through his thick insulated suit, Daniel could feel the bite of the wind trying to steal the warmth from his body, and he knew he needed to get back soon before the weather turned even worse. He was thinking about hot coffee and his warm bed when he heard the sound, and at first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him because the Arctic could make you hear things that were not really there. But then he heard it again, and this time it was clearer. It was a whimper, followed by a strange crackling noise like fire burning in the distance, and Daniel stopped walking because fire in the Arctic made no sense at all, and his curiosity won over his desire to get back to safety. He adjusted his headlamp and moved toward the sound, stepping carefully over the uneven ice because a broken ankle out here would be a death sentence. And as he got closer, the crackling sound grew louder, mixed with soft chirping noises that reminded him of birds but deeper. Behind a massive wall of ice that had been pushed up by the glacier, Daniel found something that made him stop breathing for a full second because his mind could not process what his eyes were seeing. There was a woman lying in the snow and she was curled into a ball, shivering violently. But that was not the shocking part, because the shocking part was that her skin glowed with a faint blue light and her ears were long and pointed, stretching up through hair that looked like spun silver. Next to her were two creatures that Daniel's brain wanted to call lizards, but they had wings folded against their bodies and scales that shifted colors, between purple and gold in the beam of his headlamp, and they were breathing small puffs of fire trying to warm the woman. But the cold was too strong. Daniel stood frozen for a moment because his rational mind told him this was impossible and aliens did not exist and dragons definitely did not exist. But his eyes were showing him something different, and the woman was clearly dying. She looked up at him with eyes that had no white or colored parts at all because they were completely silver-like, liquid metal, and she said something in a language that sounded like music mixed with wind chimes. But Daniel could not understand a single word. The two small dragon creatures hissed at him and positioned themselves protectively over the woman, and tiny flames flickered in their mouths as a warning. But Daniel could see they were weak and cold too. He slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm, and the woman said something else in that strange language, and her voice was desperate and pleading, and Daniel knew that tone even without understanding the words because it was the sound of someone begging for help. Daniel made his decision in less than a second because whatever this woman was, she was clearly intelligent, and clearly freezing to death, and his training had taught him that you help people in danger no matter what. He quickly unzipped his outer coat, which was rated for extreme cold, and held it out to the woman, and she stared at it for a moment as if not understanding, and then reached out with trembling hands and took it. The two dragon creatures stopped hissing and watched him carefully as the woman wrapped the coat around her thin frame, and Daniel could see she was wearing only a thin garment that looked like silver fabric and offered no protection at all against the killing cold. She tried to give the coat back to him and spoke rapidly in her language, pointing at him and then at the coat, and Daniel understood she was saying he needed it more, but he shook his head firmly because he still had 2 more layers underneath and she had nothing. He pointed toward the distant lights of the research station and made walking gestures trying to show they needed to move. But when the woman tried to stand, her legs collapsed under her and she fell back into the snow. The dragon creatures made distressed chirping sounds and breathed more fire trying to warm her. But Daniel could see she was too far gone and hypothermia had weakened her too much to walk. Without hesitating, Daniel bent down and scooped her into his arms and was surprised by how light she felt, because she was nearly as tall as him but weighed less than his equipment pack. The 2 dragons immediately flew up and landed on his shoulders and neck, and Daniel flinched, expecting them to attack. But instead they pressed their warm bodies against his exposed skin, and he realized they were trying to help keep everyone warm. The woman said something soft in her language and rested her head against his chest, and Daniel felt her shivering through all the layers of clothing, and he knew he needed to move fast. He started walking back toward the station, and the wind fought him with every step, trying to push him backward. And the woman in his arms was a constant weight that made his muscles scream in protest, but he did not slow down. The dragons on his shoulders breathed gentle puffs of warm air against his neck and face, and it actually helped against the brutal cold, and Daniel found himself grateful for these impossible creatures even though his mind still could not fully accept they were real. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Daniel saw the lights of the research station growing closer, and he pushed himself harder because the woman had stopped shivering, and that was a very bad sign in hypothermia cases. He reached the door and had to awkwardly shift the woman in his arms to punch in the entry code, and the dragons chirped, anxiously as if understanding the urgency. The door opened and warm air rushed out, hitting Daniel's frozen face, and he stumbled inside, heading straight for his private quarters, because he could not bring an alien woman and 2 dragons into the common areas without causing complete chaos. His room was small but private, and he kicked the door closed behind him and gently laid the woman on his bed, and the dragons immediately curled up next to her, breathing fire again, but more controlled. Now Daniel grabbed every blanket he owned and piled them on top of her and turned his space heater to maximum, pointing it at the bed. But after several minutes she was still not responding, and her lips had turned a darker shade of blue. He remembered his survival training about severe hypothermia, and how sometimes the only treatment was shared body heat, and Daniel knew what he had to do, even though it felt incredibly strange. He quickly removed his wet outer layers until he was down to his thermal underwear, and then carefully climbed into the bed next to the alien woman and pulled her close, sharing his body heat. The dragons adjusted their positions, nestling into the spaces between them and adding their warmth, and Daniel pulled his sleeping bag over all of them, creating a cocoon of heat. The woman's silver eyes opened, and she looked at him with surprise and said something in her language that sounded like a question, but Daniel just held her closer because keeping her alive was more important than awkwardness. Slowly he felt her body begin to warm, and her shivering gradually decreased, and Daniel closed his eyes in relief because it meant she was going to survive, and whatever happened next, they would figure out together. The warmth slowly returned to the woman's body, and Daniel could feel the change as her shivering decreased and her breathing became more steady and regular instead of the shallow gasps she had been taking before. The 2 small dragons purred softly, creating a sound like distant thunder mixed with crackling fire, and they had positioned themselves perfectly to create maximum warmth without being too heavy or uncomfortable. Daniel kept his eyes closed because the situation felt surreal, and he was still processing the fact that he was sharing his bed with an alien woman and 2 dragon creatures, and his scientific mind was screaming that this was impossible, while his eyes had seen the proof. After about 20 minutes, the woman shifted slightly, and Daniel felt her move closer, pressing her face against his chest, and then he felt wetness there and realized with surprise that she was crying. Her body shook, but not from cold this time, because these were the tremors of emotion and relief and perhaps fear, and Daniel instinctively tightened his hold on her in a gesture of comfort. One of the small dragons lifted its head and made a soft chirping sound, and then did something unexpected, because it pressed its small snout against Daniel's cheek and breathed out a gentle puff of warm air that felt like a thank you. The other dragon did the same thing on his other side, and Daniel understood these creatures were far more intelligent than any animal on Earth because they were expressing gratitude and showing trust. The woman pulled back slightly and looked at Daniel with those strange silver eyes, and they were wet with tears that caught the light from his desk lamp and made them shine like stars. She reached up with one trembling hand and placed it over her heart, and then pointed at Daniel and spoke a single word in her language, and even though he could not understand the language, he knew she was saying, "Thank you." Daniel nodded and gave her a small smile, trying to show he understood. And then something completely unexpected happened because the woman took his hand in both of hers. She pressed his hand first to her forehead and then to her heart, and the 2 dragons did the same, touching their heads to his hands, and suddenly Daniel's vision went white. Images flooded his mind faster than he could process them, and he saw a world with 2 suns hanging in a purple sky, and cities that floated among the clouds held aloft by technology or magic. He could not tell which. He saw the woman's people, and they were tall and graceful with pointed ears and flowing hair, and they lived in harmony with dragons of all sizes, from small ones like her companions to massive creatures that could block out the sun. Saw her life and her name, which sounded like Lyra in his mind, though he knew it was more complex than that. And he saw her working as what he could only describe as an explorer or scout, traveling between worlds. He saw her ship, which looked like a living thing made of crystal and metal combined, and he saw it being torn apart by forces she could not control as she tried to navigate through barriers between dimensions. He felt her panic as the ship broke apart, and she had only seconds to grab her two dragon companions and activate some kind of emergency system that would get her to the nearest habitable world. He felt the brutal cold as she materialized in the Arctic night with no warning and no preparation, and he felt her desperation as she tried to find shelter, but there was nothing except ice and snow in every direction. He felt her dragons trying to keep her warm breathing fire until they were exhausted, and still the cold kept stealing her life away. And he felt her resignation as she accepted she would die on this frozen alien world. Then he saw himself appearing like a miracle in the darkness, and he felt her shock and hope and fear all mixed together because she did not know if he would help or harm her. The images faded, and Daniel found himself staring at Lyra with new understanding, because she had just shared her entire story with him in a matter of seconds through some kind of telepathic connection. Lyra smiled at him, and it transformed her face from something alien and strange into something warm and gentle, and she spoke again in her language, but this time Daniel somehow understood the meaning behind the words. She was saying she owed him a life debt because he had saved her when he had no reason to, and when doing so put his own life at risk, and in her culture, they created a bond that could never be broken. The two dragons chirped in agreement and nuzzled closer to Daniel, and he understood they were also part of this bond because they were not just pets but companions and equals to Lyra. Daniel did not know what to say because he had just been doing what felt right, and he had not expected any kind of debt or obligation, but he could see in Lyra's eyes that this was deeply important to her. He carefully extracted one hand from the tangle of blankets and dragons and pointed to himself and said his name slowly, because he figured if she could show him images he could at least tell her what to call him. Lyra listened carefully and then tried to repeat his name, and it came out slightly musical and with an accent that made it sound exotic, but recognizable, and Daniel smiled and nodded. She smiled back and said her name again, speaking it slowly, and Daniel tried to copy it, but his human tongue could not quite make all the sounds, and Lyra laughed softly, and it was the first truly happy sound he had heard from her. One of the dragons made a chirping sound that almost sounded like laughter too, and Daniel found himself grinning, because the tension in the room had finally broken and they were no longer strangers afraid of each other. Lyra spoke again and touched the two dragons one at a time, and Daniel heard names in his mind that sounded like Ember and Spark, and he understood. These were the dragons' names, though. Again, they were more complex in her language. He repeated the names as best he could, and the two dragons chirped happily, and Ember, who was the one with more purple in her scales, breathed a tiny heart-shaped puff of smoke, while Spark, who had more gold, created a small star shape. Daniel laughed in delight because it was clear they were showing off and trying to impress him, and Lyra laughed too, and the sound filled the small room with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Outside, the Arctic wind continued to howl against the research station, and Daniel knew that somewhere out there, his colleagues were probably wondering where he was, because he had been gone much longer than expected, but inside this small room he had made first contact with an alien species and had formed a bond with beings from another world, and nothing would ever be the same again. Lyra yawned suddenly, and her eyes drooped with exhaustion because the ordeal had taken everything out of her, and the dragons also looked tired with their eyes half closed. Daniel carefully adjusted the blankets, making sure everyone was covered and comfortable, and Lyra snuggled back against him without hesitation, and the dragons curled into tight balls between them. Within minutes, they were all asleep, and Daniel was the last to drift off because his mind was racing with possibilities and questions and wonder. But eventually, the warmth and the soft purring of the dragons pulled him under. He slept better than he had in months, with an alien woman in his arms and two impossible dragons keeping them warm, and tomorrow would bring challenges he could not imagine. But for now, they were safe. Daniel woke to the sound of urgent knocking on his door, and for a confused moment he could not remember where he was, or why his bed felt so crowded and warm. Then everything came rushing back, and he opened his eyes to find Lyra still asleep against his chest with her silver hair spread across his shoulder, and the two dragons Ember and Spark were awake and watching him with intelligent golden eyes. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and Daniel heard his colleague Peter calling, his name with concern in his voice because Daniel had never missed morning check-in before, and Peter was clearly worried. Daniel carefully tried to extract himself from the tangle of limbs and blankets without waking Lyra. But the moment he moved, she jerked awake and her silver eyes went wide with fear and confusion. He quickly put a finger to his lips in what he hoped was a universal gesture for quiet, and pointed at the door, and then made a talking gesture with his hand trying to show someone was outside. Lyra understood immediately and nodded, and she spoke softly to Ember and Spark, and the two dragons went completely still as if they had turned into statues. Daniel climbed out of bed and grabbed a robe and walked to the door, opening it just wide enough to see Peter standing there with a worried expression on his face. Peter was a good friend and a solid researcher, but he was also the biggest gossip on the base, and Daniel knew he had to be very careful about what he said because any hint of something strange would be all over the station. Within an hour, Daniel stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him, and gave Peter what he hoped was a casual smile, and asked what was wrong. Peter explained that Daniel had missed the morning briefing and had not responded to any radio calls, and everyone was starting to worry, because the storm last night had been brutal, and they thought something might have happened. Daniel apologized and said he had gotten back very late and had been so exhausted he had turned off his radio and slept through his alarm, and he could see Peter wanted to believe him, but there was suspicion in his eyes. Peter asked if Daniel had managed to retrieve all the sensors, and Daniel nodded and said they were in the storage room and would need repair but were salvageable. There was an awkward pause, and then Peter asked if Daniel was feeling okay because he looked different somehow, and Daniel realized he probably looked strange because he had just spent the night sharing body heat with an alien. Daniel assured Peter he was fine, just tired and needed some coffee, and Peter finally nodded and said the station commander wanted to see him when he was ready. After Peter left, Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment trying to figure out what to do next because he could not keep Lyra hidden forever, and eventually someone would discover her. But he also could not just announce he had found an alien because the chaos that would cause could put her in danger. He went back into his room and found Lyra sitting up in bed with the blankets wrapped around her, and the two dragons perched on her shoulders, and all three were watching him with concern. Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to figure out how to communicate the problem without a shared language, but then he remembered the telepathic connection they had shared last night. He reached out and took Lyra's hand and concentrated on showing her images of the research station and the other people who lived here, and his concern about their reaction to finding an alien. Lyra closed her eyes, and he felt that strange connection open up again, and suddenly he could feel her understanding, and also her own worry because she knew her presence could cause problems. She sent him an image of herself and the dragons leaving and trying to survive in the Arctic until she could find a way to repair her ship or contact her people, and Daniel immediately sent back a strong feeling of no, because she would die out there. Lyra showed him an image of her people and their technology, and Daniel understood she was saying that if she could reach her ship's remains, she might be able to send a signal that would bring help. Daniel thought about this and realized it might be the best solution. But first they needed to find where her ship had crashed, and that meant using the station's equipment, which meant involving other people. He sent this thought to Lyra and felt her agreement, and then a feeling of trust because she was putting her life in his hands. They broke the connection, and Daniel stood up and realized that Lyra could not go anywhere in the thin silver garment she was wearing. So he opened his closet and pulled out some of his clothes. He handed her a thermal shirt and pants and thick socks, and Lyra took them with a grateful smile, and then Daniel realized he should probably turn around while she changed. So he did. The dragons made soft chirping sounds that might have been laughter, and Daniel felt his face get warm because apparently even alien dragons found human awkwardness amusing. When he turned back around, Lyra was dressed in his clothes, which were too big on her but would keep her warm, and she had tied her silver hair back with a piece of string, and somehow still managed to look graceful. Daniel got dressed himself in fresh clothes, and then had an idea because if anyone saw Lyra, the pointed ears would be the most obvious giveaway. So he grabbed a knit cap from his drawer and handed it to her. She looked confused at first, but then he demonstrated pulling it down over his own ears, and she understood, and pulled the cap on, covering her distinctive ears, and with them hidden, She looked almost human except for the silver eyes and the slight glow to her skin. Daniel decided the best plan was to get to the communication room and use the equipment to scan for the crash site while everyone else was at breakfast, which would give them maybe 30 minutes alone. He opened the door and checked the hallway and found it empty, so he gestured for Lyra to follow him, and she stood up with Ember and Spark still on her shoulders, hidden under a large coat Daniel had given her. They moved quickly and quietly through the corridors, and Daniel's heart was pounding, because if anyone saw them, he would have a lot of explaining to do. They reached the communication room without being spotted, and Daniel breathed a sigh of relief as he closed and locked the door behind them. The room was filled with computers and monitors and scanning equipment, and Daniel sat down at the main console and began pulling up satellite imagery from last night. Lyra stood behind him watching the screens with fascination, and Ember and Spark peeked out from under her coat, chirping softly at all the technology. Daniel searched the area where he had found Lyra and began expanding the search radius, looking for any sign of a crash or debris field. After about 10 minutes, he found it and zoomed in, and on the screen was a massive gouge in the ice about 15 miles north of the station, and scattered around it were pieces of something that glowed with a faint blue light even in the satellite image. Lyra gasped when she saw it and reached out to touch the screen, and Daniel felt sadness coming from her, because that ship had been her home, and now it was destroyed. But then she pointed at one section of the wreckage that was glowing brighter than the rest and made an excited sound, and Daniel understood that must be the communication system, or power core, and it was still functioning. He quickly saved the coordinates, and then pulled up the weather report and saw that another storm was coming in 2 days, which meant if they were going to reach the crash site, they needed to move soon. The door handle rattled, and both Daniel and Lyra froze because someone was trying to get in, and Daniel had locked the door, which would seem suspicious. A voice called out asking if someone was in there, and Daniel recognized it as belonging to Linda Chen, the station's communication specialist, and he knew he had to come up with an explanation. Fast, he stood up and walked to the door and unlocked it and opened it to find Linda looking surprised and curious. Daniel explained he had been running scans of the area where he had retrieved the sensors last night, and Linda nodded, but she was looking past him into the room, clearly wondering if he was alone. Daniel stepped aside, knowing that hiding would only make things worse, and Linda walked in and stopped dead when she saw Lyra standing there in oversized clothes with 2 small dragon heads peeking out from under her coat. There was a long moment of absolute silence, and then Linda said a word that Daniel's mother would not have approved of. Linda Chen stared at Lyra and the 2 dragon heads peeking from under the coat, and her mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, and Daniel could see her brain trying to process what her eyes were showing her. Ember and Spark pulled back under the coat, sensing danger, and Lyra took a step backward, her silver eyes wide with fear, and Daniel knew he had to act fast before Linda screamed or ran or did something that would bring everyone running. He held up both hands in a calming gesture and spoke quickly, telling Linda to please stay calm and give him a chance to explain, and his voice must have carried enough urgency because Linda stopped backing toward the door. Linda finally found her voice and asked what in the world was going on, and who or what was that, and were those actual dragons under that coat? And Daniel realized there was no good way to ease into this, so he just told her the truth. He explained how he had found Lyra dying in the snow during his equipment retrieval last night, and how he had brought her back to save her life, and how she was from another world, and her ship had crashed. Linda listened with an expression that cycled between disbelief and shock and fascination, and when Daniel finished, she walked closer to Lyra and looked at her carefully, studying her face. Lyra stood very still, clearly trying not to appear threatening, and Daniel was impressed by her composure because she had to be terrified. But she kept her breathing steady and maintained eye contact with Linda. Linda asked if she could see the dragons, and Lyra looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly, and then she carefully opened her coat, and Ember and Spark climbed out onto her shoulders. The 2 small dragons were beautiful in the bright lights of the communication room, with their scales shimmering between purple and gold, and their intelligent eyes watching Linda with curiosity rather than fear. Linda gasped and reached out slowly and asked if she could touch one, and Lyra seemed to understand the gesture even without words, and she spoke softly to Ember, who chirped and leaned forward. Linda's hand trembled slightly as she touched Ember's scales, and her expression transformed into pure wonder, and she whispered that this was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. Daniel felt relief wash over him, because Linda's reaction was curious rather than hostile, and he knew she was a good person who would not immediately run to the authorities. Linda turned to Daniel and asked him if he understood what this meant, and Daniel nodded because he knew that first contact with an alien species was the kind of thing that would change human history forever. But Linda shook her head and said she was not talking about the historical significance because right now they had a more immediate problem, which was that Lyra clearly needed help, and they could not keep her hidden, and they also could not let certain people know about her. Daniel asked what she meant by certain people, and Linda explained that the station commander was not a bad man, but he was very by the book, and if he found out about Lyra, his first action would be to report it to their government superiors. Once that happened, Lyra would be taken away and studied and locked up and treated as a specimen rather than a person. And Daniel felt anger rise in his chest because that was exactly what he had been afraid of. Linda said they needed to help Lyra get back to her people, without involving the authorities, which meant they would need to access the crash site and help her send a signal and all, without anyone else finding out. Daniel showed Linda the satellite images of the crash site and explained that they had maybe 2 days before the next storm hit, and after that the wreckage would be buried under snow. And Linda studied the coordinates and said it was possible to reach the site using one of the tracked vehicles, but they would need a good cover story for why they were making the trip. She suggested they could claim they were setting up a new remote sensor array, which was a normal part of their research and would give them a legitimate reason to be out there. Daniel agreed this could work, but said they would need supplies and equipment and a way to keep Lyra hidden during the journey. Linda thought for a moment, and then said she had an idea because there were supply crates that needed to be delivered to a remote cache about halfway to the crash site, and Lyra could hide in one of the empty crates on the return trip. It was not a perfect plan, but it was better than anything Daniel had come up with, and he looked at Lyra, trying to communicate through expression what they were. Discussing, Lyra seemed to understand, and she reached out and took Daniel's hand and then Linda's hand, and suddenly they both felt that telepathic connection open up. Images flowed from Lyra showing them what she needed from the crash site, which was a crystalline device about the size of a basketball that was the ship's communication core, and if she could retrieve it, she could send a distress signal to her people. She also showed them that time was critical, because the power source in the core would only last another 3 or 4 days before it depleted completely. Linda gasped at the sensation of the telepathic link, and when it faded, she stared at Lyra with new respect and said they definitely needed to help someone who could do that. Over the next hour, the three of them planned the rescue mission with Linda and Daniel, working out logistics while Lyra watched and occasionally offered input through the telepathic connection. They decided to leave early the next morning, which would give them time to gather supplies without rushing, and would also mean fewer people would be awake to ask questions. Linda said she would create the paperwork for the sensor array installation, and Daniel would requisition the tracked vehicle and supplies, and they would tell everyone they were doing a 2-day field trip. Lyra would stay hidden in Daniel's quarters until morning, which meant Daniel would need to bring her food and keep anyone from entering his room. Just as they were finalizing the plans, they heard voices in the hallway outside, and all three of them froze because someone was coming. And if they found the three of them together with Lyra, it would raise too many questions. Linda quickly told Lyra to hide under the desk while she and Daniel pretended to be reviewing data, and Lyra dove under the desk with Ember and Spark. Just as the door opened, Peter walked in with another researcher named Kevin, and both of them looked surprised to see Linda and Daniel there together. Peter asked what they were working on, and Linda smoothly explained they were planning a field installation for new sensors and needed to coordinate the logistics. Kevin seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Peter was looking around the room as if sensing something was off, and Daniel felt his heart rate spike. Then Spark made a soft chirping sound from under the desk, and everyone froze, and Peter asked what that noise was. Daniel's mind raced trying to think of an explanation, but Linda was faster, and she pulled out her phone and laughed, saying it was just her phone notification sound, which she had set to bird chirps. Peter accepted this and said they just wanted to check the satellite data for their own project, and Linda said they were almost done and would be out of the way in a few minutes. The four of them stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Daniel could feel sweat running down his back. Because under the desk, Lyra was completely still with her hand over Ember's snout to keep her quiet. Finally, Linda closed the computer files and stood up saying they had what they needed, and she and Daniel could finish planning over lunch. Daniel agreed quickly and started walking toward the door, and Linda followed, and neither of them breathed properly until they were in the hallway with the door closed behind them. They had left Lyra under the desk, but Linda whispered they would come back in 20 minutes once Peter and Kevin left, and Daniel nodded his agreement. Those 20 minutes felt like hours, but finally they saw Peter and Kevin leave the communication room and head toward the cafeteria, and Daniel and Linda rushed back. They found Lyra still under the desk with both dragons looking annoyed at having to stay quiet and still for so long. Linda helped Lyra out and apologized for the scare, and Lyra smiled and touched Linda's shoulder in what was clearly a gesture of thanks. Daniel said they needed to get Lyra back to his quarters before anyone else saw her, and the three of them plus two dragons made their way back through the corridors, moving quickly and quietly. Once Lyra was safely back in Daniel's room, Linda said she would start gathering supplies and creating the paperwork, and they would meet tomorrow at dawn. After Linda left, Daniel sat down next to Lyra on the bed and realized that in less than 24 hours, his life had gone from routine and predictable to harboring an alien and planning a secret rescue mission. Lyra leaned against him, and Ember and Spark curled up between them. And Daniel felt a strange sense of rightness about the whole situation, because even though it was crazy and dangerous, it was also the most important thing he had ever done. Outside, the Arctic sun was setting again, painting the ice in shades of orange and pink, and tomorrow they would risk everything to help someone from another world, and Daniel knew he would not have it any other way. Dawn came cold and gray with clouds hanging low over the Arctic landscape, and Daniel had barely slept because his mind kept running through everything that could go wrong with their plan. Lyra sat on his bed fully dressed in the warmest clothes they could find for her, and Ember and Spark were tucked inside her coat, staying warm and out of sight. Linda knocked softly on the door right on schedule and came in carrying two large backpacks filled with supplies, and she looked as nervous as Daniel felt, but her jaw was set with determination. They went over the plan one more time because they would take the tracked vehicle out to the coordinates, claiming they were installing sensors, and once they reached the crash site, they would have maybe 2 hours to find the communication core and get back before people started asking questions. Linda had created perfect paperwork showing authorization for their field trip, and she had even managed to get the station commander to sign off on it the night before by catching him when he was distracted. The hardest part would be getting Lyra to the vehicle without anyone seeing her, and they had decided to do it during breakfast when most people would be in the cafeteria. Daniel checked his watch and said it was time, and they moved quickly through the empty corridors with Lyra between them, and her coat pulled tight around the hidden dragons. They made it to the vehicle bay without seeing anyone, and Daniel felt a small surge of hope because maybe this was actually going to work. The tracked vehicle was already loaded with equipment, and Linda had made sure to include some empty supply crates that Lyra could hide in if they encountered anyone on the way back. Lyra climbed into the back of the vehicle and settled into a corner with blankets around her, and Ember and Spark peeked out occasionally to watch everything with bright, curious eyes. Daniel took the driver's seat, and Linda sat next to him with a tablet showing their route, and they started the engine, and the vehicle rumbled to life. The bay doors opened slowly and cold air rushed in, and Daniel drove carefully out onto the ice, heading north toward the crash site. For the first hour they traveled in silence, because they were still close enough to the station that they needed to follow their planned route exactly. But once they were over the first ridge and out of visual range, Daniel relaxed slightly. Lyra came forward and sat behind them, watching the frozen landscape pass by, and she looked sad, as if remembering how different her world was from this harsh place. Linda asked through gestures if Lyra's world was warm, and Lyra nodded and then opened the telepathic connection, showing them images of her home. They saw forests with trees that had silver bark and purple leaves, and waterfalls that fell upward defying gravity, and cities built into massive crystals that grew from the ground like mountains. They saw dragons of every size living alongside Lyra's people, and there was no fear or domination but partnership and mutual respect. The images faded, and both Linda and Daniel felt homesickness that was not their own because Lyra missed her world desperately and wanted nothing more than to return. Daniel promised through the connection that they would help her get home, and Lyra's gratitude flowed back warm and strong. After 2 hours of driving, they reached the crash site, and Daniel stopped the vehicle at the edge of the debris field, and all three of them stared in shock. The wreckage was massive, spreading across almost a quarter-mile, and pieces of the ship glowed with faint blue light, and the metal or crystal or whatever it was made of looked nothing like any human technology. In the center was the largest piece, which was about the size of a small house, and it was half buried in ice but still humming with power. Lyra jumped out of the vehicle before it fully stopped and ran toward the wreckage with Ember and Spark flying. Beside her, and Daniel and Linda hurried to follow. The cold hit them immediately because out here, without the shelter of the station, the wind was brutal, and the temperature was well below -40. Lyra moved through the wreckage with purpose, touching pieces here and there, and each time she touched something the glow would brighten for a moment as if responding to her. She reached the central piece and placed both hands on it and closed her eyes, and Daniel watched as the entire structure began to glow brighter and symbols appeared on its surface. Lyra spoke in her language, and her voice carried power and command, and the wreckage responded, opening like a flower to reveal the interior. Inside was the communication core exactly as Lyra had shown them in her visions, and it was beautiful, like a sphere made of crystallized starlight, but it was also damaged with cracks running through it and the light inside flickering weakly. Lyra carefully lifted the core from its housing, and Daniel could see her hands shaking not from cold but from emotion, because this device represented her only way home. Linda asked if it would still work, and Lyra nodded, but showed them through the connection that she would need to repair it, which would take time and materials she did not have. Here Daniel thought quickly and said they could take it back to the station because he had tools and materials in the lab that might work, and Linda agreed, saying she could help keep people away while they worked. They carefully wrapped the core in blankets and placed it in one of the supply crates, and Lyra took one last look at her ship's remains. Through the connection, Daniel felt her saying goodbye to something that had been part of her life for years, and he put a hand on her shoulder in comfort. Suddenly, Ember made an alarmed chirping sound, and Spark joined in, and both dragons were looking toward the horizon. Daniel followed their gaze and saw lights in the distance moving toward them, and his heart sank because someone else was coming. Linda pulled out binoculars and looked, and then swore because it was another vehicle from the station, and she recognized it as belonging to the security team. Daniel realized someone must have noticed. They deviated from their planned route, or maybe Peter had gotten suspicious and reported them. But either way, they had minutes before they were discovered. Lyra grabbed Daniel's arm and sent him urgent images of hiding, and Daniel knew she was right, because if security found her, everything would be over. They quickly got Lyra into one of the supply crates, and she curled up inside with Ember and Spark, and Daniel and Linda closed the lid and tried to make it look like all the other equipment. The security vehicle arrived, and two men got out, and Daniel recognized them as Torres and Wayne, both of whom took their jobs very seriously. Torres asked what they were doing so far from their planned route, and Linda explained they had noticed unusual readings on their instruments and had come to investigate. Wayne walked around their vehicle looking at everything with suspicious eyes, and he stopped at the crate where Lyra was hiding. Daniel felt his blood turn cold as Wayne reached for the latch, but then Linda called out asking if Wayne had heard about the storm warning coming in. Early Wayne turned away from the crate and said he had not heard anything, and Linda showed him her tablet with fake weather data she had quickly pulled up while Wayne was distracted looking at the tablet. Daniel moved to stand in front of the crate, blocking it from view. Torres said they needed to head back because the commander wanted everyone at the station before the storm hit, and Daniel and Linda quickly agreed. Torres and Wayne got back in their vehicle and started driving back toward the station, and Daniel and Linda waited until they were out of sight before opening the crate. Lyra climbed out looking shaken, and Ember and Spark were both trembling, but they were safe. Linda said they needed to move fast because Torres and Wayne would report back and the commander would want to talk to them immediately. They drove back to the station as quickly as the vehicle could manage, and this time they stuck exactly to their planned route. When they arrived, Torres and Wayne were already there, and the commander was waiting in the vehicle bay with his arms crossed. Daniel and Linda got out and gave their report about investigating unusual readings, and the commander seemed to accept this, but his eyes were sharp and Daniel knew he was not completely convinced. The commander said he wanted a full written report by end of day, and then dismissed them, and Daniel and Linda unloaded their equipment, including the crate with Lyra inside. They managed to get everything back to the lab without being stopped, and once inside with the door locked, they released Lyra from the crate. She was cramped and uncomfortable, but unharmed, and the first thing she did was check on the communication core to make sure it had not been damaged during the rough ride back. Daniel cleared a workbench and Lyra carefully placed the core down and began examining it closely, using her hands and some kind of sense that humans did not have. Over the next several hours, Lyra worked on the core using tools and materials that Daniel and Linda brought her, and slowly the cracks began to seal and the light inside grew stronger. Finally, as night fell outside, Lyra stepped back, and the core blazed with brilliant blue light and hummed with power. She placed her hands on it one last time and spoke in her language, and the core responded, sending a pulse of energy that Daniel could feel in his bones high above them. Invisible. To human eyes, a signal raced out into space carrying Lyra's call for help across the vast distances between stars. Lyra turned to Daniel and Linda with tears streaming down her face, and through the connection they felt her joy and relief and gratitude. She showed them images of a ship that would come for her in 2 or 3 days, and she showed them her promise that she would never forget what they had done.